an inaccurate FAA report that American Flight 11 had not hit the first World Trade Tower and was headed to Washington. And your report notes that that erroneous alert was transmitted by the FAA at 9:24 a.m., 38 minutes after American Flight 11 had, in fact, exploded into the World Trade Tower. Can you give me any way to reconcile their stated versions and yours?
No, sir. We addressed that directly on pages 31 and 34 of the Commission report. We did, more or less as you have just done, contrasted NORAD and FAA prior statements with the conclusions the Commission has reached. As you may know, sir, in public testimony, which was sworn, officials of both NORAD and FAA have acknowledged that the Commission's account of these facts is accurate and their prior accounts were indeed incorrect.
Did they explain why, how it is that they came to recognize the veracity of yours and the inaccuracy of their own?
Sir, we all regard it as a learning process, and I think further questions about the learning process at their end are directed to those agencies.
Thank you. Also, there were various reports based on sources that shortly after 9/11 that stated that very shortly after the Pentagon was struck at 9:34, quote, Pentagon officials ordered up the airborne command post, use only in national emergencies. There's another reference in another article to AWACS plane being sent up at about that time. Are you aware of an AWACS or airborne command post being sent aloft at that? This is again about between 9:35 and 10 a.m. Because your report doesn't mention one.
No, sir. The aircraft you're referring to has to do with continuity of government issues that we chose not to discuss in the report for reasons of classification. We are, however, aware of the aircraft movements you refer to and tracked the movements of that and other relevant aircraft completely. If they had borne in any material way on the 9/11 story, we would have discussed it in our report.
All right. So is the implication that they're aloft and we're organizing a air defense of the United States at that point in time, domestic air defense? Is that?
No, sir. That aircraft had nothing to do with organizing American air defense and played no part whatever in the command and control issues that NORAD faced that morning.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Dayton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I join with the others in thanking you for convening this and tomorrow's hearings. And gentlemen, thank you for your appearance and your service. I want to focus on a different set of failures that were disclosed in the 9/11 Commission report, which were the failures to, as I read it, follow some of the existing protocols and procedures and thereby a failure to respond to the actual attack on 9/11, and given especially your experience at the very top of the civilian chain of command, I'd just like to see whether what strikes me as some egregious disconnects were in fact what I perceive them to be, because we talk about this need for fundamental reorganization or reform and these different words at these levels of sophisticated intelligence gathering, coordination, et cetera, which I don't dispute. I've spent now swearing in another committee in this afternoon, about 6 hours well spent on these various aspects. But according to the Commission report, at least 2 and probably 3 orders from the Vice President of the United States through a military aide to NORAD to communicate to the fighter planes that were in the air at that time the authority to shoot down an incoming enemy plane, a hijacked plane, were not passed on to the fighter pilots by the mission commander. On page 83, both the NORAD mission commander and the senior weapons director indicated they did not pass the order to the fighters circling Washington, New York, because they were unsure how the pilots would or should proceed with this guidance. Leaving aside that this authorization from the Vice President, based on, as he's communicated, his conversation with the President occurred 2 hours after the first hijacking began and 10 minutes after the last plane actually had crashed in the fields of Pennsylvania. the fact that it was not passed on by NORAD to the pilots, to me, just is astonishing. The commission goes on in the next paragraph to say, in most cases, a quote, in most cases, the chain of command authorizing the use of force runs from the President to the Secretary of Defense and from the Secretary to the combatant commander. The President apparently spoke to Secretary Rumsfeld for the first time that morning shortly after 10 o'clock. No one can recall the content of this conversation, but it was a brief call in which the subject of shoot-down authority was not discussed. Then the Secretary of Defense, who I give full credit for going courageously to the site of the Pentagon explosion, is returned at 10:39. This is 2.5 hours now after almost 2 hours and 25 minutes after the first hijacking commenced. And the Vice President is understandably of the belief that he's passed on these orders and that they're being carried out. And the Secretary of Defense, seems to me very appropriately is saying, who did you give the direction to? And the Secretary of Defense, has that directive been transmitted to the aircraft? Vice President, yes, it has. Secretary of Defense, just to be clear. So we've got a couple of aircraft up there that have those instructions at the present time. Vice President, that is correct. It's my understanding they've already taken a couple of aircraft out. Now, if you were the Secretary of Defense in this kind of situation, and that order from the Vice President of the United States transmitted in that way to the defense of this country has not been communicated to the pilots up there, is that an acceptable procedure, or is that as egregious a failure to defend this country as it appears to me?
Certainly not acceptable. The defense never trained for this kind of circumstance.
Well, but
that's no excuse. But that's a fact.
they trained to follow out the command. I mean, that's what I'm trying to understand. Is there a failure to establish the proper chain of command? If the Secretary of Defense had given a command from the President of the United States, would that have been carried out without a question? Or in this case, given that it came from the Vice President, based on a verbal conversation with the President, who's up on Air Force One, understandably, I mean, is up there and by his own testimony is having difficulty with the communication system there, which is another concern, to communicate on an ongoing line of communication with the Vice President. The Vice President transmits an order for instruction from the President to NORAD, and it's not passed on. I mean, where's the breakdown here? Just because it hasn't been rehearsed?
I can't answer that.
No, I mean, is it? I mean, I'm astonished.
Sir, I'm not going to try to answer it, but for something of this nature, you know, there are procedures that an action officer in a command center will check that he received a valid order. I mean, very few action officers actually are talking to the Vice President on the other end. So there is a procedure and a set of very specified directions so that you get a validated order. So you know you are under the authority of the Commander-in-Chief of the United States to take an action. I surmise that that wasn't in place. It was happening in such a chaotic way, and it just wasn't there. And they said, well, wait a minute, we didn't get X, Y, Z kind of a message from such and such. And they probably said, well, how do you know this is real? I'm speculating here, sir, but we know now that we have to be ready for this. We didn't have that consciousness on the 11th of September, and my guess is that they didn't follow a pre-designated format for authenticating a communication from the President of the United States. We know how to do that for nuclear war. We've never had that for an episode like this. And so before we just say that there was an egregious failure of duty, my guess is there are some operational details I need to understand better before I could jump to the conclusion and said that it was a dereliction of duty. I don't know that
I'm
it's
not
that
suggesting that at all. I think people were individually responding, according to their own judgment. Certainly the Vice President was running the command post there and the like. But the fact that we weren't receiving the kind of incoming enemy attack that we thought we would be receiving in some other circumstances,
yes,
obviously is not.
I certainly understand your question, yes, sir.
The other point I would just make, because it leads to, and I don't out of time here, but due to I think the good graces of the chairman of the committee and his location of National Airport in the state of Virginia, we're operating that with some risk to the Capitol, to the White House and the like. We had a situation with the governor of Kentucky, which has been largely overlooked by the Congress and by, I think, the powers that be in the last about 2 months ago, that says to me, if you look at the failure again of the communications, we evacuated this entire complex, a couple thousand people literally running for their lives out of the buildings, because of the failure again, and I can't get into this all, of the FAA to communicate with NORAD, to communicate, in this case, with the Capitol Police. So, you know, the axiom, what is condoned continues. Yes, we were caught very much by surprise on 9/11, but I see continuing evidence of the failure of these established procedures to be followed in a situation 2 months ago. Fortunately, it was the governor of Kentucky in a propeller plane rather than some other kind of attack. But it really alarms me. And Mr. Chairman, I just would submit, and I hope we can pursue this, because we can know all the intelligence reorganization and we can spend billions more or billions differently, but if we don't have basic lines of authority that we're going to follow in those situations of national emergency, I mean, it doesn't matter, frankly, how much we spend, it's going to fail again. Thank you.
Senator, point is well taken. The Senator's point is well taken. Dr. Schlesinger.
I can well understand why you were perturbed, but
Stunned.
but not astonished. You know, the order to shoot down a passenger airliner is met with a certain incredulity, and we were not prepared for this occasion. A fundamental point to bear in mind is we had a clear chain of command, and yet there was a failure. Reorganization is not going to solve that problem.
Right. Thank you. Thank you.
Senator Dayton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen. Mr. Secretary, the 9/11 Commission report, I'm quoting here on page 43, states, in most cases, the chain of command authorizing the use of force runs from the President to the Secretary of Defense, from the Secretary to the combatant commander. President Bush, because of, by his account and others, communications problems on board Air Force One that morning, was having difficulty establishing communication with the Vice President on a consistent basis. The Commission goes on to say here that the President spoke with you for the first time shortly after 10 o'clock, which would have been almost 2 hours after the first hijacking began. No one can recall the content of this conversation, but it was a brief call in which the subject of the shoot-down of these incoming hijacked planes authority was not discussed. At 10:39, the Vice President updated you on the air threat. The Vice President was understandably under the belief that since he had communicated twice, possibly 3 times, according to this report, through a military aid to NORAD, the authority from the President to shoot down an incoming plane that did not detour, that was the instruction that had been passed on. The NORAD commander told the Commission, both the mission commander and the senior weapons director of NORAD indicated, and I'm quoting again the Commission report, they did not pass the order to the fighters circling Washington and New York because they were unsure how the pilots would or should proceed with this guidance. What is the necessary chain of command to be established so that an order directed from the President, verbally from the Vice President, to NORAD is carried out, or is communicated, I should say, to those who must carry it out?
Dick Myers and Dr. Cambone were with me that day. The way you've stated it is not the way I recall it.